we have not talked to men about what it means to be a man, what it means to be masculine in a world where women are your equal.
It's a lot of pressure to put on anyone to say you are the sole person responsible for providing not only for yourself, but for everybody else in your family.
About 10 years ago, I was introduced to some men who were part of an organization called the Mankind Project. And, in brief, the Mankind Project is focused on helping men develop mature emotional masculinity or emotional maturity as men. And it's a worldwide organization. There are over 100,000 of us who are, part of the Mankind Project. The foundational event that happens in the Mankind Project is a weekend experience that is sort of structured around the psychiatrist Carl Jung's archetypes, so specifically the king, the lover, the warrior, and the magician, and Joseph Campbell's cultural mythology of the hero's journey. And so the weekend experience, basically you show up on Friday evening, you have your name taken from you, you're given a number, there's a separation from community, a descent, an ordeal, an initiation, a return. I dislike the word transformational because I think it's way overused. And at the end of my weekend, I came away feeling like I had been sleepwalking through the first 55 years of my life. And so that started me down a path. The path for me actually began many years before, but I wasn't really aware that that's what I was doing. But it started me down a path of doing work with men. And I, got very engaged with Mankind. I went back and staffed weekends for other men. And, oh, by the way, there are groups of men that meet around the world, sponsored by the Mankind Project, weekly or every other week, whatever it is. One of the things that we would train men after they'd been through their weekend was, look, if you're facilitating a man through a piece of work in the men's group, be careful not to traumatize or re-traumatize him, because we're not trauma experts. And so at some point, I don't know, a year and a half, 2 years after my weekend, I decided, fine, I'm going to learn something about trauma. And I sat through a trauma recovery coaching certification program. As you can well imagine, part of sitting through that kind of a program is surfacing your own trauma and, uncovering it, facing it, healing from it. And it was simultaneously the most challenging and ultimately rewarding thing that I've ever done in my life. So I decided that I wanted to do what I could to help men. And, we can get into a little bit about, I'm a man, I'm not a woman. So I understand things from a man's perspective. We are taught from the time that we're children that it's not okay to show weakness. Boys don't cry. We can't be vulnerable because that's weakness. Needing emotional support is weakness or asking for it. God help you if you ask for it. And so a lot of those sort of childhood wounds that really are traumatic, right? We tend not to think of them on the surface as traumas, but there's a therapist and author out of Boston whom I adore named Terry Real. And Terry wrote the first ever book on male depression in the mid-90s called, and I love this title, I Don't Want to Talk About It, right? And, one of the things he says in there is he said, the idea that these sort of repetitive things that we do to boys in their childhoods is trauma, recognizing them as trauma is kind of like expecting a fish to be able to see the water that it swims in, right? It's really hard. And so what happens for a lot of men, when I started doing the research for the book, because I didn't want to just be, spouting my own opinions about things, I came across a statistic from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, and this was from 2020, that men are approximately a little tiny bit less than half the population in the United States, yet we make up 80% of successful.
I remember reading that women have more suicidal attempts, but successful are heavily weighed toward the male. Yes.
And by the way, there are lots of ways to kill myself that don't make the statistics. until I began doing all this work, I had this sort of vague sense of something missing and dissatisfaction and isolation and loneliness. Even though I was married, had 3 kids, great job, house in the suburbs, had all the outward signs of success, but there was something missing. And so in my instance, I come from an Italian family, so I sought solace in food. Food was good, it tasted good, it didn't judge me, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what happened was that I ballooned up to 407 pounds. I developed type 2 diabetes. I have 3 stents in my heart, right? So, I damn near myself. In fact, when I went to see the cardiologist, because for the first time I was having chest pain, he's like, we're going to do this now, because if you have a heart attack, it's going to be fatal.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So, I was that close. Right. Anyway, so I have started working with men to help them understand and uncover their traumas. That statistic on successful in the US is pretty consistent around the world. The numbers basically work out to everywhere in the world, every minute of every day, some man himself, right? And as I said, that doesn't include alcoholism. That doesn't include, you don't have to just stick a gun in your mouth, right? So the numbers are probably a lot larger than that.
Yes.
Along the way in my life, I also decided that I was really interested in behavioral psychology. So I did my graduate work in behavioral psychology, focused on language. And, I discovered then, discovery for me, right? And scientists have come to understand a great deal more over the last 20, 25 years that how we speak about the things that happen in our lives is not a response or reaction to those experiences. It is how we create those experiences, right? Yeah. And one of the other really interesting things to me that I learned about trauma, there were some researchers at Harvard Medical School, again, back in the 90s sometime, who interviewed a bunch of trauma survivors, came up with a list of questions and statements that they wanted to ask them or say to them to trigger a flashback. And then they put them in a functional MRI machine. And when these survivors began to have a flashback, the whole right side of their brain, the home of the limbic system, the amygdala, the fight or flight response, lit up like fireworks on the 4th of July. What really surprised them, though, was that the left side of the brain almost completely shut down. And one of the areas on the left side of the brain is an area called Broca's area, which is involved in the production of speech. And so what they found with these trauma survivors is that they could remember traumatic events from their childhoods like they were looking at a photograph, but they could not tell you how they felt when it happened, because that part that would have allowed them to give language to what was going on was shut off. And, I give an example in the book from my own experience. Mother's Day, 1970. Now, I'm 64 years old. Mother's Day, 1970, I was a month short of my 10th birthday. And my father and I were in the driveway behind our house, washing our Chrysler Town and Country station wagon, ugly olive green with plastic wood paneling. I can remember where the sun was. He was on one side, I was on the other, and something pissed him off. And among the things he said to me was, remember this day, Mother's Day, 1970. Now, it's almost 55 years later. I don't remember what got him angry. I don't remember what I had done or hadn't done. But I remember Mother's Day, 1970.
You still remember that, yes.
Yeah, it's powerful stuff. So, they kind of say all roads lead to Rome, right? I mean, the personal work that I've done with and outside of the Mankind Project, the graduate work that I've done in language, the trauma recovery coaching stuff, all of that has converged really nicely in a way to bringing me to this place where I know enough and have experienced enough on my own to be able to maybe help some men through this, right? And so, that's background. I know that the focus of your podcast is narcissism. And, as you and I were talking about before we started recording, narcissism is trauma.
I 100% agree with you. And while the focus is narcissism, as you rightfully point out, I'm interested in trauma generally, healing tactics generally. And I'm so thankful, as I mentioned in our pre-conversation, that I have a male on the show, because so often when we think about abuse of any kind, then put on it narcissistic abuse, we think of the woman as the victim and the male as the abuser. And I think the evidence is pretty clear that it's about 50-50 when it comes to narcissism. There are just as many female victims as there are male victims, and just as many male narcissists as there are female narcissists. And the only difference is, I think, is that society, as you rightfully pointed out, allows women more freedom to express their emotions and their situations and to tell their stories of abuse, where males are taught from a very early age, suck it up, be quiet, internalize that stuff, don't let it out. And so to have a male come on and discuss not only your own personal experiences with it, but also what you see working with other men is really remarkable. And I appreciate it very much.
Well, it's so totally my pleasure. Everything you just said about what we teach boys is absolutely true. And the impact that sort of repetitively reinforcing those concepts of masculinity in boys, when they get to adulthood, that stuff is mostly unconscious.
Yeah, you're right.
They don't know it. They don't know it. The clients that I work with almost exclusively when I first start working with them are like, yeah, I need some help. I think maybe you can help me. I didn't really suffer any trauma as a child. And within a session or two, of course they did, right? And bringing that into consciousness is sort of a necessary first step to begin healing from it, and can also be really traumatic itself.
Oh, yes.
Right? When you discover all these things that you've forgotten or didn't realize from when you were younger, and begin to connect them to the things that happen in your adult life or with your adult behavior that you wish the heck weren't true, suddenly, oh my God, it's an entirely different perspective, and it opens up a whole Pandora's box of stuff that you get to deal with.
Yes.
Look, it's a privilege to be able to get to the place of being able to get to deal with it. Because, talk about that statistic, we don't want to end up in that place. We truly don't want to end up. Now, so I talked about my background with understanding language and, the whole thing about how the brain operates during a trauma. What scientists also understand is that language is not just important, but critical to trauma recovery and healing from trauma. And it's absolutely critical, or absolutely, the most significant part of the infliction of the trauma in the first place. Don't cry, grow a pair. What's the matter with you? Right? Exactly. All of that kind of stuff, what scientists know now, for many, many years, we believed that the brain was sort of a static blob inside of our heads that was unchanging. What we now know is, in fact, the brain is very plastic in the sense that, even with a major trauma, right? A head trauma, a part of the brain gets damaged. Other parts of the brain over time take over the function of that part that was damaged.
Yes.
But the other thing that they understand now is that circuits within the brain can be rewired based on experiences. So, this sounds simple. It's not, but, the most important thing to bring to bear in healing from trauma is giving different language to the experience. Because those circuits were hardwired in your brain when you were a kid. And the only way to rewire, literally, not, it's not a philosophical discussion, right? The only way to rewire those circuits is by giving different language to the experiences.
Could you give an example of that?
Yeah, I'll give, this is a little bit of a general example of how it works, right? I'm sure you're familiar with the term amygdala hijack,
yes.
Right? An amygdala hijack is not a term of art, right? It's a physiological response to something going on in the environment. And the amygdala is a very evolutionarily ancient part of the brain, and the whole, fight or flight response, the amygdala, hippocampus begin to pump stress hormones into the body. Your blood vessels expand, so the more blood can get to your muscles. Your pupils dilate some, so you can get more light and see better. Your lungs expand slightly, so you can make better use of oxygen. All of these are physiological responses when an amygdala hijack happens. And, that was a great thing to have happen when you were in danger of having your rear end chewed off by a saber-toothed tiger on the Serengeti Desert, right?
Yes, yes.
And when an amygdala hijack starts, there is nothing you can do about it because it is a completely physiological, automatic response, and your rational brain is off. So, in my case, how that used to show up was explosions of rage at my wife, at my children, at friends that really in the end were not about them at all. And, before I really began to study this and dive deeply into this stuff, when one of those explosions would subside and my rational brain was back in control, I would feel so much remorse and so much sadness for how I had acted. And, great, but by then the damage was done. Right? And all I could do was the best I could do to try and repair that damage. But that's tough, right? So, what I teach men and women is to begin to practice during the course of a day, paying attention to your body. Right? My head is clear. I feel this, big expansiveness in my chest. I have a smile on I'm happy. Or, I've got this burning behind my eyes of stress across my shoulders and my chest feels like I'm angry. And so the more that you can practice that sort of body awareness during the course of a normal day, the more skilled you become at recognizing it when you're about to tip over.
So you have early warning signs that it's about to happen.
And you can take a step back and breathe and go, okay, I'm not in danger of having my butt chewed off by a saber-toothed tiger. I'm okay here. What's going on for me and what's underneath it?
So, whenever the amygdala is hijacked, you have fight, flight, fawn, freeze.
Right.
And your response was to fight, basically, to become...
No. My response when I was a kid was to fawn.
Okay, all right.
Because I couldn't fight with my dad.
Mine is to freeze. I freeze. So does that same process work no matter which?
Yeah, because we can describe those different reactions, right? And they've been described, as we just said. And at the root of it all is the same physiological system operating.
So by understanding those underlying feelings, you can kind of feel whenever it's going to come on. And so before in my case, I freeze, I can use language to sort of work my way out of that. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, you are. And the key thing is, recognizing that you're about to freeze.
Yes.
That's why the body awareness practice during the course of a day, just so you start to understand, this is what's going on in my stomach. This is what happens when I'm, afraid.
Wow, that's incredibly helpful, and it makes total sense. So then by understanding what's going on in our body, we can use our rational brains to sort of talk our way out of it so that we don't have the amygdala hijack going on.
And, one of the other things that I coach my clients on is, particularly if you get triggered in an interaction with your partner, right? Especially in the beginning before you become, well practiced at what we've talked about. If you at least are aware that you're about to tip over, but haven't, gotten that awareness early enough to calm yourself down, you tell them, look at your partner and go, I need a timeout.
Yes.
And timeouts are non-negotiable. Conversation stops. You go wherever you go to get away from that situation until you are calmed down enough to be able to come back and have the conversation as an emotionally mature adult. And if you think you're ready to come back and you still got those butterflies in your stomach and the tension, you're not ready to come back. Take as much time as you need. And as much time as you need, maybe, 10 minutes, it may be an hour, it may be overnight.
Mhm.
But, negotiate with your partner ahead of time. Hey, if I ever ask for a timeout, it's for me, not for you. And non negotiable. And conversation stops. So don't be trying to continue the conversation with me, yell at me as I'm walking out the door, any of those kinds of things.
Yes.
Let's stop. Let's breathe, take a little bit of time and space, come back and talk about it as adults.
This is a little segue, and I'm just going to go on it for a moment, but I actually wrote a blog on timeouts and how it played out with my narcissist. So, one of the things we were taught in couples counseling was to use the timeout method. But this is how he sort of would abuse it. And I'm just interested to hear your take on this. So, he claimed that he was an alcoholic, and the first time he assaulted me and was arrested for it, he was heavily, heavily intoxicated. And so part of our reconciliation was that he was not going to drink. So what he would do is he would be planning, even though he was in alcoholic counseling for his alcoholism, we were in couples counseling, he agreed not to do it. He would plan to go out drinking with his friends. And when I would confront him about that, he'd call a timeout and say, if I texted him or talked to him, I was breaking the timeout. So, and he did that so he could go out and party with his friends and not have me badgering him.
That's sort of a classic narcissistic behavior.
I would love to hear you talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, narcissism is at its root or underneath it is trauma, right? Whether it's the victim of the narcissism or the narcissist themselves,
Exactly.
it traces back to trauma. And one classic aspect of behavior of a narcissist is it's always all about you.
Always.
It's not about me. If only you had, why didn't you? You did, therefore, right? And look, nobody's born a narcissist. It also comes from childhood wounding. Tell you a quick story about my ex-wife. Outwardly, you first meet her, she walks into a room, the whole room lights up. She's that kind of gregarious, right?
Exactly.
And
Yes.
he has done, literally 40 years of women's personal work. I always, during the time that we were together for about 9 years, I always tried to be the best me I could be because I expected that was what she expected of me. And because she had done, so many years of women's personal work and I was relatively new to men's personal work, I put her on a pedestal. And the pedestal that I put her on was that she was more grounded, more emotionally mature, more enlightened, more whole than I was. And so when she would say things to me that didn't feel like they fit with who I was, I would take them on. Because how could she be wrong?
I see. Yes.
Right? And I would agonize over what is it she sees that I can't see. Why is it that she believes to, change this is such a simple thing? If it were that damn simple, I'd have done it already. What am I missing? Right?
Yeah.
It wasn't until very near the end of our relationship when we were in couples coaching, um, and the coach one session had decided to do some inner child work with her. And, did a visualization where she brought her little girl out on her lap and talked to her and, guided her through that conversation with the little girl. The thing to understand his background, which, totally clicked after that experience for me, is she was one of two kids. She was the older sister. And her younger sister was born with some pretty serious health issues. Her mother and father divorced when she was fairly young. Her mother focused all of her attention on the younger sister, understandably,
Yes.
and really had no time or emotional support available for her. And she ended up living with her dad. And, I never knew her father because he died before we met. But, everything I've heard about him, he was a rah, rah, great guy, everything's positive, yada, yada, yada. And, you know, one of the things that she had told me about was that when she was in high school, that she was a hell of a student. And her father had basically said to her, he called her kid. Her father basically said, kid, apply to any college you want to, I got you. And when she graduated, it was time to go to college. Sorry, kid, I don't have any money, you're on your own. So she experienced emotional abandonment from both of her parents, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And she has buried that so deeply. She doesn't know she's a narcissist, right? So in that session with the coach, when visualization was through and the coach said to her, so how was that? She said, I didn't feel any connection to her whatsoever. It was like maybe I walked into a park and there was a little girl sitting crying on a bench. And of course, I was going to go over and comfort her, but I had no connection to her.
Wow.
And like I said, if you met her and she walked into a room, you would go, oh my God, this woman is amazing. And in so many ways, she is amazing. And she does a lot of great facilitation of women to help them through their issues. She's never turned those skills in that lens.
That rings so true to my story as well. When my ex would walk into a room, same sort of thing. Everybody, he's so charismatic, he's so charming. And he would often, even behind closed doors, brag to me about that, how he could charm people and how he could sway people. And he was very proud of that ability. And he would often critique me and say, you can't, you're like a bull in a china shop. You just go in, you're raw. I'm not winning anyone over, with my personality. I'm just sort of, this is who I am. But he was very charismatic. He's a professor. He's pretty successful with his publications. Believe it or not, one of his areas of research is violence and PFAs. But behind closed doors, you get a very different person.
One of the big, bold, flashing neon lights clues came in our very first session with the coach, only I wasn't able to recognize it then, where we were, essentially introducing ourselves to the coach and, whatever. And she said, I am a master facilitator and communicator. There's one thing to own my skills. There's another thing to say it like that. And the fact of the matter is, she is a master communicator and facilitator in her professional life. And, in our relationship, she really wasn't. The only thing she was ever able to communicate to me is where I was falling short of her expectations.
Yes, they're very good at that. They're very good at pointing out your flaws. Some flaws you didn't even know you had. Like in my case, I didn't realize I was awkward. I didn't realize I was weird. I didn't realize all these things. And I don't think they're actually true. I think they're things that he told me to lower my self-esteem, lower my confidence, make me easier to manipulate, make me easier to control. That sort of was his agenda.
I don't know a couple of things. First of all, I don't know if it was to make you anything, because nobody could make you anything, right?
True. Yes.
I would bet good money that a lot of those kinds of things he said to you were projections of himself on you.
Yes. He projected all the time. Yes.
And you know what? We're human beings. We all have judgments about everybody every day. What a jerk that guy was in traffic. How sweet the person was in the checkout line at the grocery store.
Exactly. Yes.
It's what we do with those judgments that makes the difference. And projections are not necessarily negative, right? It can also be positive projections. Ekho is amazing. She's got this podcast. She's got this incredible background, speaks all these languages, yada, yada, yada. I have wish that I were like Ekho, right? Or maybe I might not even get to that place. Fact of the matter is, there may be a whole lot going on in your world that I have no clue about.
Oh, I'm sure there is. In everybody's world, yeah.
My projections on you are about me. They're not about you. They're about me. God, I wish that I were more, blah, blah, blah. But, we tend to push those out into the world on other people. the value in projections for me is what it helps me, if I can be aware and think about it, what it helps me learn about me.
Yes, 100%. And I don't see how we can, in a way, not project because
Right?
unless I'm understanding the term wrong, it's sort of why wouldn't I interpret other people's actions in light of what's going on up here? Why wouldn't I do it that way? So I often tend to think people have good intentions. I tend to think they didn't mean to harm me. I tend to think, oh, they're just blunt and being themselves. Even when they are trying to harm me, even whenever, it has often led me to misjudge people and think people were my friends who clearly did not have had good intentions in their heart. But how else do we interpret our world except from our own perspective and what we've experienced in our life?
You have no idea whether that other person, you know, is a jerk. You have no idea whether that other person really wanted to be sweet and not, you don't know, right? So, for example, if you see me angry, right, you have no idea what's going on with me. You are interpreting what you're seeing in me through the lens of your own experience of anger.
Yes. Yes.
By the way, I might not know any better than you do what's going on in me, right? Unless I'm able to, do what we talked about before, take a step back and go, what's really going on here? The guy was just driving slow in the left lane. Why am I so bent out of shape that I want to run him off the road? What's up with that? Not about him. It's about me. So what is that? Because that's the thing that I can affect. That's the thing that I can have an impact on, right? Maybe he is a shit driver, right? And I'm not going to change that.
You're not
I
going to teach
can,
him how to drive. Yeah.
I can swerve around him, cut him off, flash him the bird, or I will just wait for my opportunity to gracefully go past him and keep going on my way, right? Don't know what's going on with him. Doesn't matter. None of my business. What matters is what's going on with me.
And once you realize that, which I'm still learning that and I'm still realizing it, what you can control, your sphere of control versus what you can't, your life becomes a lot better, a lot calmer, a lot simpler because there's no sense in me even focusing on that.
Yeah. And listen, Ekho, as much work as I've done and as well as I understand this stuff, literally a week ago, I had an explosive outburst with one of my friends here who also was having an explosive outburst at me. And boy, oh boy, that amygdala kicked in and I was, ready to fight. Once again, afterwards, when I was able to calm my nervous system down and the adrenaline stopped flowing and, all that kind of stuff, I was like, okay, what really went on here? Clearly, he was triggered by something that led him to speak to me in a way that reminded me of my father and tipped me over the deep end into fighting. Because, by the way, I said my default response when I was a kid with my dad was to fawn, right? If I could be nice, if I could be a better boy, whatever, whatever, whatever. Now I'm a grown ass adult. I'm a big guy, 6'2". I can fight, baby. Right? And so I do when I get triggered like that, when I'm not able to intercept it before it happens, right? And not the guy that I want to be or believe that I am 98% of the time.
Yeah, we're all working on ourselves. And I think I also read, and it kind of rang true, is we all can be toxic. We really can. And it's about sort of identifying that in ourselves and just keep working on it so that we don't add more trauma to this world that already has a lot of trauma in it.
One of the tagline for the Mankind Project used to be changing the world one man at a time. And, it really is an important thing for us as men because, like I said, all those childhood traumas have turned us into the guys that we are. And it's no more comfortable for us than it is for the people in our lives who are on the other end of it. And, as I think I also said to you, well, in general, those traumatic events from childhood are repressed in our unconscious mind, right? Terry Real, the guy that I mentioned before, um, in I Don't Want to Talk About It, still love the title of that book. Um, he calls that covert depression.
Covert depression. Okay.
Right. And so hidden from the people around me. Oh, by the way, hidden from myself in my unconscious mind. Right. And, that term is a term that is only beginning to get some currency in the world of psychology and psychiatry. Right. They had other terms that sort of roughly described it. But Terry says that the only way out of covert depression is overt depression. And overt depression is that time when I can no longer contain it in my unconscious mind and it bursts forth into consciousness, right? And so part of the work that I do is trying to help men uncover that in a therapeutic coaching environment so that they can manage it becoming conscious as opposed to all of a sudden it bursts into consciousness. I go buy an AR-15 and shoot up a grocery store, or it bursts into consciousness. I beat the living hell out of my wife and kids, or any of the thing, even less nefarious than that could happen when all of a sudden it explodes out, right?
Or you harm yourself, maybe.
Or you harm yourself. I was just going to say, or you go jump off the Golden Gate Bridge, or you go stick a gun in your mouth, or right?
There does seem like there is a shift in the last few years, at least, to sort of recognize that this idea of toxic masculinity, not masculinity, but toxic masculinity, it really is harmful to everybody, as you point out. It's harmful to society, to women, to children, but it is harmful to men. Maybe most importantly, it's harmful to men. And them being, for years as children, starting in childhood, not being allowed to express emotions, feel love, and express that, cry openly.
Yep.
Quickly, I'll tell you a story. I'm very big about talking about emotions and feelings with both of my children. I have a male and a female child. But my son was about 5 and my daughter was about 4. And he got upset and was crying. And my uncle said to him, "You don't ever cry in front of a girl. Even if you have to cry, you go and hide so a girl doesn't see you cry." And, I corrected that situation as best as I could without making it too awkward, and then talked to my son later about that. But what I was thinking at the time is my uncle repeated that because that must have been what was drilled in his head as a child.
Sure.
And how does that manifest in your life?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's even worse than that, if you will, right? Another one of the things that Terry Real is my muse, right? So another one of the things that Terry says is, because we teach boys these things from the time that they're literally babies, right? And we assume femininity in girls. It's okay for girls to need emotional support. It's okay for girls to cry. It's okay for girls to be fragile. It's okay for girls to show weakness or vulnerability. Couple of things are true as a result of that. Going back to that statistic, women are much more likely to present to a therapist with sadness or depression, whereas we guys are far more likely to go see our primary care physician and go, "Hey doc, something's wrong. I'm stressed out. I have a hard time breathing. My chest is always tight. What's wrong with me?" And, doctor does the EKG and, all the things they do. And they go, "You know what, Jim, nothing's wrong with you. Try to reduce the amount of stress in your life." Hasta luego.
No help, really. Yes.
No help, really, because, we're talking about the physical symptoms that are really symptoms of a psychological issue, right? And so one of the other things that Terry says is, we assume femininity in girls, we confer masculinity on boys. And what that means is that we can also withdraw it.
Okay.
So, Jim's a guy's guy. He's the cool dude in class until that day in gym class when we have to shimmy up a rope and Jim can't do it. And then he's a wuss, he's a pussy, he's, whatever. And we do feel vulnerability. We do feel sadness. We do feel weakness. We do feel all those things that we're told we're not allowed to feel or demonstrate overtly. And it's not just the psychological impact that those things have, but a physical one, right? A lot of men's health problems, digestive issues, high cholesterol, coronary artery disease, all of those things can be traced back, not in 100% of cases, but all of those things can often be traced back to stress that's not being handled, repression of feelings and things that are going on, rather than surfacing them and dealing with them directly. So it doesn't only have psychological impacts, it has physical impacts. Now, the other thing on the topic of toxic masculinity, this is timely in a lot of ways. The last 30, 35 years, present political situation in the United States to the side for a moment. In the last 30, 35 years, women have made great strides in stepping into their power with their rights that were theirs all along, right? We just didn't acknowledge them. And what has not happened at the same time is we have not talked to men about what it means to be a man, what it means to be masculine in a world where women are your equal.
That's very timely, yes.
I don't want to make this a political thing, but the liberals, and I are one, right? The liberals and the progressives have been celebrating the progress made by women. But to the men, the response is either they ignore us or they say, stop whining, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Well, imagine the reaction you would have had 20 years ago if I had said to you, Ekho, stop whining, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You might have punched me in the nose.
I might have, yes. I might have, yes.
Yeah, right. But so, beginning to shift those definitions of what it means to be masculine is hard work and requires some focus and attention that isn't happening right now. And oh, by the way, I think the strides that women have made, thank you, Jesus, it's about goddamn time, right? And there are women out there who are equally as, I don't know what the word is that I want to use, but, will tell men to shut up. You've got white European male privilege. I don't want to hear what you have to say. You need to listen to me. That's simply the opposite of what we've been doing to women.
Right? I don't think it's helpful. I do not think it's helpful.
Yeah. Fewer men are graduating from college. Fewer men are, finding a career that, can enable them to provide. Look, providing is not a bad thing, right?
No, but it's a lot of pressure to put on anyone to say you are the sole person responsible for providing not only for yourself, but for everybody else in your family. That's a lot of pressure.
If I didn't graduate college and so I'm a plumber, let's just say, right? And you are my wife, somehow or other we came together and found each other, and you've got a PhD in economics and you are the CFO of a Fortune 500 company making, high six figures a year. That further sort of highlights the tension. And, hopefully a husband and wife are good with that, right? And, I know some guys that their wives have amazing careers and they are completely happy being home husbands, right? Taking on that traditional role of taking care of the kids, cooking, cleaning, all that kind of stuff. You got to be really comfortable in your masculinity or in your concept of masculinity to be able to do that. Because in the toxic masculinity that you described, that is completely unacceptable. And so more and more younger men are finding it incredibly difficult to get into meaningful relationships with women, because in a lot of cases they are beginning to feel inferior.
That's so interesting. And I can tell you that even I've seen that firsthand. So the father of my kids, not my narcissistic ex, but the father of my kids, for whenever we decided to have children, he was a stay-at-home dad. And people on both my side of the family and his side of the family were, especially males, were very uncomfortable with that. They looked down on him. They didn't like the fact that he did that. And then whenever we separated, I actually rightfully paid spousal support for a while because he had gone at this point years without having a job because he was a stay-at-home homemaker and father. And so until he got on his feet, I paid spousal support. And again, the criticism from primarily men, but also women, and on both of our families was remarkable. These same families that their wives stayed home while they went to work, that was fine. But whenever it was reversed, suddenly there was an issue with it.
I don't know what to say about that other than it sucks and we need to change that, right? I have 3 kids. My oldest is my daughter, and she's married and has 2 children, one of whom is barely 2 months old. Cannot yet wrap my brain around the idea that I'm a grandfather, but that's beside the point. My son-in-law has taken parenting leave from his job, and he's staying at home helping her with the kids. And I mean, he's amazing with the kids. And, he cooks more often than she does. And, he teaches my granddaughter how to make pancakes and, do all that kind of stuff. Fan-friggin-tastic. I love it, right? I absolutely love it. Now, do they get criticism from their friends? I don't know, but I don't think so. But, that's a perfect example of what you were just talking about. Here's a father who, and my dad, for all the issues with my dad, my mother was a nurse, and I have one younger brother. And when my younger brother was school age, my mother went back to work. And she was working a 3 to 11 shift as a nurse, and she would try and cook and have food ready for us when we would come home before she went off for her 8-hour shift. And my father, to his eternal credit, decided that wasn't okay. And so he started learning to cook, and he started doing laundry.
Good.
He started doing, and this is a traditional Southern Italian. He was 17 years old when he came to the States, right? Kind of a guy who stepped up in a big way to, right? To treat my mother as an equal partner, not as a servant. Right? We need to teach more men that it's okay to do that.
So what do you think it's going to take, or what are some steps, or maybe even what are you doing in your work specifically to try to change this narrative, to try to eliminate this toxic masculinity and develop a healthy sense of masculinity where people can, regardless of their sex or gender, talk about their feelings, express their needs, deal with their past traumas?
There may be people who tune into this podcast, and I've had this experience having been a guest on a couple of other podcasts where people afterwards go to the podcast and go, "Oh my God, that was incredible. It really impacted me." And what I've said to them is, put those people in touch with me.
Okay.
If I can help somebody just by listening to them and talking to them, and I said I'm a coach, I'm not a therapist. Okay. The difference for me is my role is to stand beside you and walk beside you down your path. And I may tell you, hey, there's a ravine over here, or there's I can tell you where to look, but I'm not going to tell you what you should see there.
Not to do, yes.
And so, I'm always happy to talk to anybody who's struggling and could use a listening ear. Beyond the individual trauma coaching that I'm doing, beyond the book, I'm actually begun work on a second book on the power of language. I am working with a couple of other guys to start putting together some virtual online men's groups. We've also talked about eventually getting to a place where, we may do like a weekend summit or a weekend workshop on, reparenting your little boy, or, realizing your uncovered childhood emotion. I'm making up the topics, right?
Yes, no, I get it. Totally, yeah.
There's certain topics that I think are beefy enough that, a dedicated weekend workshop would be a really, really good thing.
Would be fantastic.
Wherever that ends up happening, obviously I'm partial to where I'm living because it's absolutely gorgeous. It would be a lovely place to have men come. But, I mean, I'm talking with the very first interview that I did with a guy who's based in Brisbane, Australia. And he and I were talking last night, as a matter of fact, about, putting together, because he's interviewed mental health professionals and, he's interviewed all kinds of different people, and I'm one. But he's got this idea about wanting to put together a summit on men's health.
So needed.
People. Yeah, yeah. And when he and I first talked, he said, Jim, he said, there's one day a year in Australia that's dedicated to men's health. And the other 364 days a year, nobody gives a shit.
No one cares. Yeah.
Right. And so, beginning to do more of those kinds of things, maybe I'll get to a place where I start my own podcast, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I'm one man at a time, right? I wish I could do 1,000 men at one time, but I can't. Nobody can. I say maybe somebody will prove me wrong, but So I mean that's and for every man who, I don't mean this the way it sounds, for every man who wakes up, he may help another two men, and those two men may help another two men. And, eventually we have that ripple effect where, it becomes a thing. Am I going to see that bear fruit in any significant way in the 20, 25 years that I have left on the planet? I don't know, but I'm going to try like hell.
I love the imagery of the butterfly effect, and in a way, that's what we're all trying to do. I think who are either survivors of certain types of abuse, whether it's narcissistic or any other type, or authors, or anyone that's dealing with this healing and trauma and coaching and recovery, is the butterfly effect. We're just trying to make our little mark and hope that it ripples out. And even if it influences one or two people, then they can go out and they can go out. And I would venture to guess, I might be wrong, I'm often wrong, but that you will see some improvement, if not a lot, in the next 25 years. Because we've come a long way in 25 years. No one was talking about toxic masculinity. Oh, you have a butterfly tattoo, a Mariposa, no?
That was my point. I believe in the power of the butterfly, right? I got them tattooed on my arm.
I love that. I absolutely love that.
Just a real quick, brief story. I used to be a civilian pilot many, 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 many years ago. There's a thing that they teach you called the 1 in 60 rule. And the 1 in 60 rule basically says if a plane strays off course by 1 degree, in 60 miles, it'll be a mile off course. Another 60 miles, it'll be another mile off course, right? In aviation, that's a bad thing. Well, the way it applies to the men's work, as far as I'm concerned, is, small shifts can make a big difference farther down the road. You're not going to flip a switch one day and all of a sudden be the emotionally mature, happy guy that you always have wanted to be. It's going to take adjustments along the way, a scoop here, a scoop there, and eventually you get to that place, right? So, ergo, the email address.
I love how everything about you is a symbol or it has a story. You're very thoughtful, like your butterfly tattoo sort of is how you think of life. Even your email is combines your past history as a pilot with your current work. It is amazing how all these sort of avenues in life, just these little side trails come into a path, and that is your path.
It's a beautiful thing to get to my age and be able to look back and go, oh yeah, that made no sense at the time, or I never went anywhere with that then, but look how it plays today.
It really is amazing how all these little paths in our life do seem to direct us toward our mission.
You have a greater appreciation for the person that you are because of those experiences, positive and negative, that you've had than somebody else who hasn't had that kind of adversity or opportunities for growth in their lives.
Not that I'm advocating everyone should experience trauma and abuse and all that, but by experiencing the gamut, the whole range of human emotions, it makes you more human, makes you more empathetic. And it really, I oftentimes, my personal perspective is we're not humans that have spiritual experiences. We're spirits that are having a human experience. And it's part of the human experience to really feel the range of emotions and then hopefully not get jaded or angered too much or too drawn to the negative, and instead use it for a positive impact.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
So we probably should say goodbye, but thank you so much for coming on the show. I'd love to have you back again.
Love to come back.
Jim, I can't thank you enough.
Ekho, thank you.